With the new adventure Vecna Eve of Ruin dropping soon, I wanted to explore exactly who is Vecna. GameMasters here, and a couple of videos ago we did an in-depth look at the Rod of Seven Parts, as it will be a fairly big MacGuffin, and an item that players will need to find in this new adventure in an attempt to stop Vecna from obliterating the multiverse. But we didn't really dive into who or what Vecna is. Today, we're going to explore exactly who Vecna is, who he pals around with, and what's the big deal about his hand and eye. So grab yourself a coffee or your favorite beverage of choice, and let's jump back in time to the first mention of this entity. We initially land in 1976 to thumb through Eldritch Wizardry, a supplement by Gary Gygax and Brian Bloom. And while we don't get anything solid about Vecna as an individual, we do, however, get three items referencing this being. The first is the Sword of Kas, but in it is this item's description, that we are told that Vecna is a legendary lich. A few pages later, and we get the Hand of Vecna and the Eye of Vecna, respectively. The Hand of Vecna is described, more or less, as being dried, shriveled, and possibly burned, and that it, along with the eye, is all that remains of the lich Vecna. It goes on to explain how to use the hand and the eye. Essentially, you lop off your hand and shove the shriveled stump, or shriveled up hand onto that stump, and the hand will affix itself. Likewise, with the eye, you'd pluck out an eye and place Vecna's eye within the new empty eye hole. Both the hand and the eye contain powers, and keep in mind that this was in an era in which the DM customized the powers, so there was no telling what either could do, either the hand or the eye could do in any given game, or any given table at which these two items were found. What this passage does state is that the moment you begin to use them, they get more difficult to remove, using them up to 10 times, and they become a permanent part of your body. While attaching the hand to oneself, it causes your alignment to shift fully evil. The eye will cause one to become chaotic in alignment. Moving forward to 1979, and in the Dungeon Master's Guide, we again are given the Eye and Hand of Vecna, as well as a description for the Sword of Kas. Regarding the eye, this is where things take a slight turn. Previously, Vecna was said to have been utterly destroyed. However, in this advanced Dungeons & Dragons version, it cites that legends say that the phantom of this once supreme lich still roams the material plane. It also states that the eye itself appears as an agate until it is placed into an empty eye socket, which, if you are hell-bent on gaining the powers of this eye, imagine all the different agates and gems you'd have to attempt to shove into your skull before you found the right one. In placing the correct one in, your alignment, instead of shifting to chaotic in the original edition of D&D, this one shifts you to neutral evil, and you may never change to anything else. The Hand of Vecna expands a bit of information about Vecna himself, in that he imbued both the hand and the eye with powers that would allow them to persist long after the physical remains turn to dust. Also, too, slapping it to a wrist stump will allow the hand to instantly graft itself to you and will grant to you a strength of 18 over 00. The Hand of Vecna also can shift one's alignment, just as in the original version, but here, that will only happen should you attempt to use one of the hand's primary powers. Again, these are chosen by the DM, and it will shift you to neutral evil. The more times you use the powers, the less likely it will be to remove it. And like in the past version, should you use it enough, it will be impossible to remove. Most of the description from the OD&D to AD&D of the hand and eye remain the same. However, with the Sword of Kas, we see a fair amount of additional lore added. It states, when Vecna grew in power, he appointed a most evil and ruthless lieutenant to serve as his bodyguard and right hand. The henchman was the Lord Kas. And it goes on to say that Vecna gave unto Kas a sword of unimaginable power, and for a long time Kas served Vecna, but that eventually the sword urged Kas to dispatch Vecna and rule in his place. It fails to elaborate exactly how Kas defeated Vecna, but legend does say that Vecna also destroyed Kas at the same time, and the world was made brighter that day. Moving to 2nd edition AD&D, and we again turn to the Dungeon Master's Guide. In the center column on page 91, we are given a small blurb about the Hand of Vecna, that it is imbued with the spirit of Vecna. It also states an odd history of the hand, that it appeared about 136 years after the Lich was defeated, and appeared during an insurrection of a group called the Yahites. But during an overthrow of Padden the Vain, the hand simply disappeared. Later, the hand would be discovered by a fisherman, and for several decades he kept it until his brother killed him and stole it. That brother was also slain by an individual named Mace, who reigned for nearly 100 years in the city of Tyrus. But then the hand turned on Mace and ceased to function when he was slain by an assassin. The rest of the description goes on to tell of how it pops up in various places within history, but it also gives us a list of suggested powers. And remember, up to this point, the DM was to pick the hands and the eyes powers. And while in second edition, the DM can still do that, this version simply is providing some suggestions. They are Death Ray, Cause Disease, Animate Dead, Darkness, +2 Protection, Web, Disintegrate, Regenerate, Lightning Bolt, and Time Stop. But this is where it gets fun. Well, for the DM anyway. It states that those that see the hand will covet it, wanting it for themselves, but that the hand can see the moment of its owner's demise and will stop working just at that given time. What's further interesting is that neither the eye nor the Sword of Kas are mentioned. Keep in mind that up until this point, the Lich Vecna has only existed in tales of legend and spirit. Also keep in mind that Greyhawk was the home base world that Gary Gygax created and played in, and it is in this realm that we see Vecna return from the dead in Vecna Lives. Before we jump into Vecna's physical forms, I want to first thank these hand supporters. Their contributions to this channel have been beyond generous, and I cannot thank them enough. They keep their eye on me and help make sure that I produce good content. And if you'd like to contribute, I'll leave a link down in the description, and of course, I'll add your name to this ever-growing list, and you'll get my undying thanks. Vecna Lives is set in the world of Earth, the planet where Greyhawk is. It is considered to be a high-level adventure intended for 6 to 8 players of 12th to 15th level. It was not an easy adventure, and in fact, there is this very specific line. This adventure is meant to kill characters. And that should give you a hint as to how strong and powerful the Lich Vecna truly is. Now, we're not going to dive too terribly deep into the story of Vecna, the adventure itself as presented in Vecna Lives, as even it itself states that the information within is a collection of truth, contradiction, and misinformation. However, using my history of being a dungeon master and making heavy use of meta-knowledge, I'm going to try to paint, as best I can, a depiction of Vecna that firms up those lines between truth, contradiction, and misinformation within this book. What I have come to understand is that Vecna was once human, possibly half-elven. He was a wizard, and of course sought power untold. As he grew in age, he sought to overcome death. There are 3 stories. He became so powerful that he was able to imprison his own death, thus cheating it. He offered the great powers of the outer planes, or he offended, rather, the great powers of the outer planes, and that is what cursed him to dwell on the threshold between life and death. And the third theory was that he discovered the secret to lichdom and transformed. We are provided with other names that he has been called throughout history. Lord Vecna, the Whispered One, the Master of the Spider Throne, the Undying King, and the Lord of the Rotted Tower. It is after Vecna becomes a Lich that he crosses path with Kas. As with previous editions, Kas rose through the ranks of Vecna's army, eventually taking on more and more power. Kas took on the daily affairs of Vecna's kingdom, presiding over council even in Vecna's name. And because of this, Vecna forged the Sword of Kas. This sword was sentient, evil in alignment, and over time would whisper to Kas things like, "You are greater now than your master, and you are the true ruler of all his lands." And Kas snapped. He gave in and attacked Vecna in his darkened tower. Vecna fought back, but in the end the tower crumbled and Kas was never found. All that remained was the Sword of Kas, Vecna's hand, and Vecna's eye. Millennia passed. Long time passed. And during that time, those objects would surface, wreak a touch of havoc and chaos, and then get lost to time again. Eventually, a small group came together, bent on finding those artifacts. They became known as the Cult of Vecna, and through them, Vecna began to return. And go back to one of the earlier mentions of Vecna's hand. He had imbued it with power, a slice of his soul. As the cult grew in power and in size, and as the hand was found and used, Vecna became more real. started to coalesce into something solid. With the hand cropping up over millennia and his cult growing in size, Vecna amassed the powers of a demigod. Because in AD&D times, that's really all it took, a sizable amount of people worshiping you to become a demigod. But Vecna being granted immortality through that cult was not enough. He wanted a greater godhood. Vecna discovered 7 artifacts, spread them throughout Greyhawk, and in an attempt to block the other gods' worshippers' prayers from reaching those gods, in turn, Vecna would rise to power, as only his worshippers' whispers would be heard. This is where the adventure of Vecna Lives begins, and more information than ever is thrown at us, both about Vecna but also about Kas. Vecna has discovered portals that can lead to specific moments in time. He is searching for one that will take him to the moment of when Kas chopped off his hand and poked his eye out. However, this is about the time when the characters will face Vecna, or at least an avatar of him. Keep this in mind as we shift a moment over to Kas, as we learn that Kas is a vampire. While legend states that Kas attacked Vecna and Vecna in return toppled his dark tower, leaving no trace of Kas, the truth is, Vecna opened a gateway and sent Kas to the plane of ash. Now keep in mind that while Vecna is spending centuries influencing from beyond those who would fuse with his hand, so too Kas spent centuries imprisoned on the plane of ash. Energies from the negative material plane slowly seeped into Kas's body and ate away at his heart and soul. Just as Kas was to die, he didn't. And those negative energies transformed him into a vampire. Should his physical form be destroyed, he turns to mist and retreats until his corporeal form can be restored and made whole again. Now, let's return back to Vecna's avatar. When the characters face off with them, they too are sent to the plane of ash, and it is here that they must find Kas and convince him to help them defeat Vecna once and for all. Finding Kas and through conversation, Kas explains that Vecna cannot be destroyed as he is immortal now because of his demigod status. However, he can be reduced in power. Finding a way back to Greyhawk, the characters will confront Vecna, and upon opening a portal, they will push him through. When the portal closes, only his hand and eye will remain behind. Now understand that what I've just provided was a very watered down version of the adventure. There is a lot more to it, but for sake of this video turning out to be a 6 or 7 hour video, I simply wanted to provide the most important elements. Another second edition book to give us information is the Book of Artifacts. In it is information about the Sword of Kas as well as the Hand and Eye of Vecna. But what's interesting here is that it provides suggested means of destruction of those items. For example, to destroy the Sword of Kas, one of the suggestions is to wipe all memory of Kas from Earth. Remember when in Vecna Lives, we talked about how the characters would need to push Vecna into a portal, just send him far away. We get a supplement for Ravenloft called Domains of Dread, and we learn that when Vecna was sent through that portal, he landed in a plane of ash. In that plane of ash that he sent Kas to, but that it has become the domain of dread known as Burning Peaks. This specific domain has 2 masters, Vecna and Kas, who are locked in an eternal fight to destroy each other. Later, we would get an adventure called Vecna Reborn, also an adventure, this one taking place in Ravenloft that would expand upon what little information we got in the Domains of Dread supplement. While again, I'm not going to go into details of this adventure as it has little bearing on the who of Vecna, I will share this. During this adventure, should the players fail to accomplish the specific task of the adventure, then Vecna is reborn, and it will be outside of the domain borders that imprison him, allowing him to wreak vengeance upon the multiverse itself. Then we were given Vecna Die, also from 2nd edition D&D, and this adventure assumes that the players were successful in Vecna Reborn, and that he remained imprisoned in his domain of dread. Of course, this adventure also assumes new characters are playing, and while some of the locations call back to events from Vecna Lives, the ending provides options should the players fail, or if they are ultimately triumphant in defeating Vecna. It also goes into explaining how Vecna is trekking to Sigil, and it is there that the final battle ultimately takes place. And so the big question here is, does the Lady of Pain interfere? Of that I can say this. Should the players eradicate Vecna from Sigil, they will be granted a deed to a permanent residence in Sigil. By the time 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons came around, he was established as a deity. Vecna was a deity now. One of the few entities to not see a retelling or let's go back and retcon this character's past. I like that. In the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, it is explained that Vecna has been around for thousands of years, and that after escaping his extraplanar prison, he became a lesser god. It also explains that he continues to search for his missing hand and missing eye, which are, once again, lost. In Deities and Demigods, Vecna is listed as being neutral evil in alignment, and we are given some full-on stats for him. Skills, saves, feats, hit dice even. And while some of the abilities give us a touch of insight, there are a few things of extreme interest. He was considered to be a deity of secrets and was once a mortal king that became a lich. In 3rd edition, Vecna evidently has 20 d12 hit dice, an AC of 51, and was just otherwise a nasty foe. Dropping into 4th edition D&D, and the Dungeon Master's Guide states that Vecna is a full-on evil god of undead, necromancy, and secrets, but he still wants to take over the world. It is also mentioned, or rather, 4th edition also mentions the Eye and Hand of Vecna, and while there is a fair amount of information about those artifacts in the DMG, 4th edition was very rules-heavy, so it didn't exactly expand upon the lore itself of those objects. However, in another 4th edition book, Open Grave, we are provided with a few more goodies about Vecna himself. For example, 2 of his chief rivals are the Raven Queen and Orcus. We are also provided with stat blocks for what is known as the aspect of Vecna, which is a physical manifestation of Vecna done via a ritual of his cult members. It states that Vecna himself can see everything this aspect sees and knows everything it learns, but moreover, it also has powers similar to those of Vecna. There is also in here a very odd passage called the Scroll of Mother Rain. It depicts a slightly distorted origin of Vecna, but also calls for instructions of sorts of his cult. Because this falls under the realm of possible misinformation, I'm not going to go too much into detail here. Again, I don't want to create a 5 or 6 hour video, but I will say that if this screenshot isn't clear enough to pause on and to read, you can find it in the 4th edition Open Grave book on page 215. Finally, we are brought up to 5th edition, and there is a surprising amount of information about him here. In the Dungeon Master's Guide, we learn that he has a legendary artifact called the Tome of the Stilled Tongue. He also holds the Book of Vile Darkness. Within it are supposedly every evil thought, every example of black magic, every devious action that Vecna has come across, all written down. Of course, we are again treated to the Hand and Eye of Vecna, along with their magical properties. And what's interesting about these 5th edition versions is that the DM is once again prompted to choose those properties. The Sword of Kas is also presented, and each of these artifacts are detailed out pretty much how they always have been. Kas used the sword to attack Vecna, and that Vecna smote Kas's ruin, both defeating each other, thus making the world brighter. Almost word for word from the 1st edition description. And why that is important is because 5th edition does not strive to retcon Vecna's history. Sort of. Show you that and I'll explain in a second. A couple of years back on D&D Beyond, we were given the Vecna dossier. It goes on to explain that Vecna is known across several worlds, not just Greyhawk, as much of what we've talked about today was limited to, but it also states that he was the son of a hedge witch and never knew his father, that his mother was cast out by an order of wizards for practicing necromancy, but that a scribe took Vecna in instead of him too being cast out. Vecna would sneak into the library and self-educate, but during these study sessions, he would often hear a voice. A whisper from another world that promised him revenge on losing his mother. He in turn massacred that order of wizards and began penning his Book of Vile Darkness. The dossier describes how Vecna created a kingdom within Greyhawk, ruled for several centuries there, within his obsidian tower, all the while hearing that voice inside his head. During those years, he would venture out and conquer cities and realms, becoming more and more powerful. Over time, his physical body began to fail him, but his hatred kept him going long enough to learn necromancy for himself, and he transformed into a powerful lich. Finding not much left within Greyhawk of interest, Vecna turned to other worlds, still hearing that mysterious voice in his head, and it is during this travel to other worlds that he took ownership of a palace in the Plain of Ash. He would eventually meet with a fallen paladin named Kas, forge for him a sword, and ultimately be betrayed by Kas, losing his hand and eye in the process. No one knows exactly why Kas betrayed Vecna, but some theorize that the mysterious voice that whispered to Vecna for all those centuries began to now whisper to Kas, urging him to destroy the Lich. During the battle, Vecna managed to send Kas to the domain of Tovag in the Shadowfell. He himself spent several centuries searching for his severed hand and plucked out eye. He eventually explored the Outer Planes, where he grew in power and became a god. Now, up to this point, that is where we are left with the knowledge of who Vecna is in 5th edition. We know from a blurb on the back of a new book, Vecna Eve of Ruin, that he is searching for the Rod of 7 Parts, with which he intends to use to obliterate the multiverse itself. But everything that we have touched upon has been fairly consistent with Vecna, and how he, as well as Kas and the artifacts surrounding him, have been presented over the past 40-ish or so years. While there are certainly some finer details about Vecna and the lore surrounding him that we didn't touch upon, as mentioned, I didn't want to do a 5 or 6 hour video. Everything that we did talk about today is what's been deemed as the most important elements about Vecna. Hopefully, some things were brought up that will help arm you against him when the new book, Eve of Ruin, comes out. Oh, and keep in mind that Eve of Ruin delves into Vecna searching for the Rod of 7 Parts. And if you'd like to know more about that specific artifact, I made an extensive video going over its history and powers. So be sure to watch that video next. What do you think is the voice that's been whispering to Vecna and Kas for centuries? Let me know down in the comments, and until next our paths cross, may you know all there is to know about Vecna.